Well, thank you very much, Bosjan, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak here. It is, I think, my third time talking in Ljubljana on three quite different subjects, but the one at the minute is, as the brief introduction says, kind of looking at and trying to understand the particular economics of climate breakdown in a way that I think is reasonably novel, doesn't often get talked about. And in particular, and I'll start with this point, as a sort of challenge to conventional ideas of how climate change and the nature crises operate. That the sort of Hollywood version of climate change, and I'm doing a bit of a risk here with the audience. If people have seen Don't Look Up, do people like Don't Look Up? The correct answer to this is no, not really, by the way, because, of course, it's actually a pretty terrible film in terms of both its kind of underlying politics, which is that basically there are some smart people who know the truth and the stupid people fail to see it. Now, this is one thing and another, right? That version of politics is not doing any liberals, anyone on the centre-left, any favours anywhere in the world right now. Let's just sort of keep that in mind. But the other bit is its presentation of the climate change itself is everything is fine and then suddenly it's cataclysm. And what really ought to be clear by now is that you don't actually get the cataclysm. I mean, maybe we will, right? You can sort of sit there and say there is a probability of a genuinely catastrophic series of events happening, that the risk to human civilization in total, all life on the planet, that sort of thing. It is sort of there. But the actual climate and nature crisis we're experiencing is a different pace. It's the pace of things just not working as well as they used to. It's the pace of things costing a bit more than they used to, particularly in the developed world. Particularly when you start to think about how, if you're in some of the richer countries, that climate change has moved from being something big and distant. It's the Arctic ice sheets melting, it's the poor old polar bears dying. I mean, these things are bad, but they're a long way away, and they're not specifically here. And if you want to care about them, you can, but if you don't care about them, who cares? And actually the climate crisis turns into, instead, things just not working properly. The plane you're on, which is doing its own bit to contribute to climate change, is experiencing more turbulence than it used to because of climate change. The cost of flying, therefore, starts to creep up because it's more expensive, because you use more fuel in the plane if there's more turbulence. Olive oil, which has now crept into a kind of essential, even in Britain. I mean, this is a radical change in the last 30 years of my life. Olive oil has shot up in price 200% because there's been droughts followed by floods across much of the Mediterranean, which damaged olive harvests over the last 2 years or so. That isn't the end of the world. It just means that shopping's a bit more expensive. So in other words, and this is where I start, it's not a cataclysm. It's not like everything finishes and there's going to be a big, terrible event in the future. The end of the world is, in fact, here. The title, in case you're wondering, although somebody may, I hope, recognize the late, great jazz improviser Sun Ra here in a car park in California, presumably having returned from somewhere like Saturn, judging by his dress. Excellent song called It's After the End of the World, Don't You Know That Yet? And that's kind of where I'm getting to with this. I wanted to start somewhat parochially, with, it's about 2 days to the British general election on Thursday, July the 4th. Overwhelmingly likely that a rather tedious Labour Party, led by the rather tedious Keir Starmer, will win, and win very, very significantly. This is current Prime Minister, the Conservative, Rishi Sunak. Thank you. You can boo at Don't Look Up as well, by the way, but it's okay. We'll leave the film criticism to another time and stick to the politics. So yes, here's Rishi Sunak, drenched in outside number 10 Downing Street, announcing that the general election would be on July the 4th. And this is, 5, 6, whatever the date was. 22nd of May, I actually wrote it down, which was well done me. And that morning, there are two things that happened that morning that contrast. The first is that the UK's official inflation figures were out. And this is not greatly exciting unless you are Rishi Sunak, who saw the inflation figures, which is that we were just about back to the 2% target for British inflation after this massive surge in inflation over the last couple of years or so, primarily driven by the sort of energy price shock in Britain as across the rest of Europe, arising from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And inflation's come back down somewhat to around about the target of 2%, 2.3%. It's actually fallen a little bit further now. the Prime Minister was moved on this sensational bit of news, which, by the way, I mean, inflation coming down, everyone here knows this. Inflation coming down doesn't make things cheaper. It just means things are getting more expensive less quickly, right? That's how inflation operates. But anyway, he puts out this incredible statement saying brighter days are ahead, which is part of the reason, I think, that he was moved to call this snap election. It's the Prime Minister's choice in Britain, really. It's great having an unwritten constitution, so it's Prime Minister's choice to call the election. Largely on the back of these inflation figures, suddenly looking a bit better. Brighter days are ahead, says Rishi Sunak. On the very same morning, his deputy, Oliver Dowden, was putting out another press release on the very same morning that the Prime Minister was saying brighter days are ahead on the back of inflation. Putting out another press release to announce that the prepare.gov.uk website was being set up, which if you go and log on, this is what you're confronted with. It has this nice, it's actually in black, it's quite sort of intimidating. You can go and look if you like, prepare.gov.uk, there you go. It says, how would you prepare for an emergency? Big writing, emergencies such as floodings, fires and power cuts can affect us all. There are simple and effective steps you can take to be more prepared. And there's a list of recommendations what you as your average British household might do in the event of all these terrible things which they list, which includes, you know, epidemics, forest fires, water shortages of various sorts. There is a kind of running theme through this, which I'll come back to. But the one that really leapt out for me was their recommendation on bottled water, which is there is no standard figure for how much water you ought to keep in the house in case supplies kind of run out for unspecified reasons. The World Health Organization says 2.5 to 3 litres of drinking water a day. The government kind of hints that what you need is 10 litres per person per day in a household will make you comfortable by also providing for basic cooking and hygiene needs. So a household of 4 needs 40 litres of bottled water sitting around in case water supplies are cut off for some period of time, right? Brighter days are ahead. And if you look down the list of what the government says might occur, which is, of course, these water shortages. Why are the water shortages? Well, there's a drought. There are fires. There's another pandemic that breaks out. They chuck in a bit of terrorism as well. But the underlying theme is that these are all, nearly all, climate and nature crises. But brighter days are ahead. So if you want to think about what the politics of all this looks like, it's that clash, it's the collision between, on the one hand, the Prime Minister insisting that brighter days are ahead, because inflation is a magic number of almost 2%, at the same time as his deputy is putting out a website saying, hey everyone, be scared and get yourself prepared for a whole load of terrible things that are about to happen, right? Brighter days are ahead. This is the politics of after the end of the world. This is what it looks like. And you can see how it's going to play out over the next 5, 10, quite possibly forever, God help us, which is this continual dialectic between various institutions and institutional people insisting everything is fine, normality is returning, everything is good, and at the same time, the absolute collapse of various pretty basic things like, you know, in your big developed country like Britain, your water supply doesn't in fact work for a whole list of reasons. Now, you know, Britain is kind of crappy in lots of its own particular ways, and there's already problems. There's been a horrible pollution incident in the southwest because of our ridiculous privatised water system. All the rivers are flooded with sewage. I mean, literally all the rivers are flooded with sewage. It has its own particular problems. But the general crisis that is here is precisely that alternation between the two things. Brighter days are ahead, normality will return, everything's going to be fine, or quick panic, right? And there isn't some rational way, I don't think, for the politics we have and the political institutions we have and the economics we have, which is really my point here, to get through that. It is either one thing or the other. We either think of climate change as the cataclysm that will end everything, or we think it's not really important to us. Actually, you end up somewhere in the middle. You end up wandering backwards and forwards between thinking everything's fine and everything's actually bad. By the way, inflation is going to go up again. I mean, it's not just me saying this. The Bank of England's own forecasts say this. But of course, inflation's going to go up because the underlying driver, once you strip out, I mean, Russia isn't going to invade Ukraine again. It's already done that, right? So that can't happen again. Once you strip out that big shock, you can start to pick out specifically individual items that are directly affected by the climate and nature crisis. Olive oil I've mentioned. Air travel, somewhat bizarrely, I've mentioned. Orange juice is shooting up in price. Why is orange juice shooting up in price? Because there's a drought in Florida and Brazil, combined with the spread of a horrible disease, which is wiping out orange juice crops in both those places. The price is going up. And then there's more obscure things that start to happen as a result of climate change. The Panama Canal has been in the middle of a drought, which is affecting Central America for the last sort of 18 months or so. It is severely restricted in the amount of goods and ships that can travel through it. They've had to reduce the water level. The Panama Canal unusually relies on fresh water collected in reservoirs because there's a drought, those reservoirs are dry. P.S. the population of Panama also has to try and use these reservoirs, so that's a fun new clash that's being set up, because the government can either get water to people or get money from ships going through the canal, so there's one to ponder. They've had to reduce the number of ships going through the canal. That's massively whacked up the travel time, because either there's 130-odd ships queued up to go through, or you have to go all the way around South America either way. And as a result, liquefied natural gas in Asia coming from the US that used to go through the Panama Canal now costs more. And the other one, I mean, you can carry on like this for some period of time. The other one that was really striking, and this was like utterly bizarre in terms of not having thought through the consequences of climate change. French river water is hotter than it used to be. Because French river water is hotter than it used to be because of climate change, French nuclear power plants can't run at full capacity like they used to in the summer because the water is too hot to cool the power plant properly. So they're having to reduce the amount of power coming out of power plants from French nuclear power plants. France is a massive exporter of this electricity to the rest of Europe. The price of electricity in Europe has gone up as a result. This happens over and over again. This is not, in the sense that we're used to, normal. This is something new and different. It is not the end of the world. It's something beyond this point where everything's just a bit crap. I do think that Cory Doctorow, the technology writer, coined the useful term enshittification, a sort of portmanteau in English, to describe the way that the internet over time is steadily getting worse, which surely people have noticed. I was trying to use Google Maps to get here, and you know what, it's not what it was even 5 years ago. You can see it getting worse. You can see the studies, by the way, what amuses me, and I'll come back to this, on artificial intelligence. Like ChatGPT is getting worse over time at doing things like answering maths questions, you know, but hey, artificial and general intelligence is going to take over the world. So it's the enshittification of the internet. Now, what you get with climate change and the nature crisis is something like the steady enshittification of everything. A whole load of things that used to work just don't work in the way that they used to. So let's try and put that into a bit of a sort of a more theoretical frame, let's call it. The crucial issue here, I think, is one I take from the work of Jason Moore and Raj Patel in particular, although other people have touched on the same point, which is that the big driver of capitalism is something like competition, which motivates accumulation of capital. And because it's competitive accumulation of capital, there's an endless search to drive down costs. If you can cut costs as a capitalist, you will do better than other capitalists. And for a really long period of time, they suggest 500 years, but let's take at least the last 250 or so since the Industrial Revolution, this mechanism has basically meant that you can have capitalist growth across the world. You do have falling costs, and you have an expansion of consumer goods. You have a broadening range of different things you can buy, and those things fall in price over time. And that's the mechanism that's ground away for a very long period. What we're facing with the arrival of this sort of never-ending climate crisis and a never-ending nature crisis, put them together and call it the Anthropocene, is a reverse of that process. That although the drive in capitalism everywhere is to do something like, because of competition for profits, you have a drive to squeeze out costs as far as possible. What you're finding instead is that it is not possible to squeeze out those costs. Everything starts to cost more because the material fact of production is harder than it used to be. It is harder to grow oranges in Brazil than it used to be. The price of oranges goes up. Now, there's a detail on this, which is two parts. One, because we do in fact live in a capitalist global economy that is still motivated by competition and the drive to accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets, as Marx put it. This is the primary motivation to do this. But we're not actually having very much growth. There's a heavy incentive and a heavy ability for those capitalist institutions, the major firms, often in alliance and increasingly in alliance with the major states, to use market power to turn those rising costs into extraordinary profits. And if people have seen the work of Isabella Weber in particular on cost push and sellers inflation that she's been writing for the last couple of years, this is the mechanism. That you have the underlying change in how the natural world is organized. You have capitalist institutions motivated to compete and accumulate, and therefore motivated to exercise market power that turn that crisis of shortages and rising costs in the material reality we all live in into enormous profits, which we've seen over the last few years. The global agribusinesses, on the basis of shortages in various kinds of foods, have made all-time high profits. If you take the top four who control 70% of the world's sort of food trade. They're making profits that they've never seen before. And more obviously, you've seen with oil and gas over the last few years, again, all-time record profits on the basis of shortages, rising costs. You exercise market power, it turns into these incredible profits for you. Now, the detail here is this final bit, or the second part, which is essential consumption. That if we still live in a capitalist world, and we obviously do, and if there are rising prices, and if the free market is operating, and it sort of kind of does, then you would anticipate people will go, I'm not going to pay more for something, I'll buy something else instead. The absolutely critical part I think we're facing here is that you can do that if it's, price of a cinema ticket has gone up. Okay, so you don't go to the cinema, you stay at home and watch Netflix or something instead, except Netflix has gone up as well. So, you read a book, or you go to the park, or you do something more wholesome than sitting in a darkened room for 2 hours, right? And cheaper, not just more wholesome. I'm really anti-film at the minute. Honestly, I'm not. It's like, go to the cinema if you want, just don't watch, don't look up. You can go and do these things. You switch. You have a choice. Right? You don't have to go to the cinema. You don't have to watch Netflix. You don't have to read a book. You don't have to do any of these things. So you can do something else. So you spend your money differently. You can't do that with food. You can't do that with water. You can't really do that with energy, with the fact you need electricity for a whole bunch of things to function. And I'm going to argue, although it's the more tenuous one, but I think it works, you can't really do that with the digital economy in the developed world at the minute. And across these 4 sectors, because they're essentials, if we're faced with rising prices, resulting from shortages, resulting from profiteering, you will continue to consume those things. And you'll squeeze your consumption elsewhere. You'll say, I'm not going to the cinema because I need to eat. Or I need to get hold of water, or I need to keep the lights on. There's a list of ways this might operate. And you can see this happening already in the developed world in particular, which is kind of where it applies most obviously, because you have a wider range of things you could be buying. That already people are switching out of non-essential consumption, increasingly looking to buy essential things that they need that are rising in price because they have no choice. Now, you can switch around a bit. You could say, okay, I'm not going to go to, I don't know what the Slovenian equivalent to Waitrose is, but the expensive supermarket, you go to the cheap one, you go to Lidl or something like this, right? You can change the kinds of foods you buy, but at some point you're going to have to buy food. So a world operating like this, an economy operating like this, is one in which those institutions that dominate the supply of those essentials are going to be increasingly profitable and increasingly powerful. And everything else is getting squeezed. Which means, of course, in turn, that the way the economy operates as a whole starts to look rather different. That instead of a world in which you had something like falling costs, competition driving falling costs across capitalism in general, huge expansion of consumer goods, rising real standards of living, broadly speaking, over the last sort of 200 years or so, really since the mid-19th century, let's say, when capitalism kind of stabilizes itself, at least in the sort of core, and gradually actually spreading to the rest of the world. I mean, if you take what's happened in the last sort of 20 years or so, the extraordinary movement of people from absolute poverty into not that much better off, but substantially better off in China in particular, that you can see this progress of capitalism that has happened, that because growth has been so great, because costs have fallen so much, it has produced real increases in living standards for a long period of time. Now, there'll be bits in that where you do not have a real increase in living standards. You suddenly find yourself in the Great Depression. You find yourself without a job after the global financial crisis. But if you take the broad spread, this is what it looks like. And that's a powerful mechanism on one side because it's falling costs, and it's a powerful mechanism on the other side because if real wages, real incomes are rising because costs, particularly of essentials, particularly of food, water, energy, that sort of thing, are falling, you can go and buy more stuff. And this is the point where something like Keynesianism starts to work. Because you can talk about then effective demand. Because you have already spent this amount of money on the stuff you actually need to live. Food, water, energy, maybe data now, probably housing, that kind of thing. You spent it over here. You then have a load of money you can spend elsewhere. And there's a powerful mechanism in capitalism where you having this load of money is a market that can be sold into. So you have a consumer market that can exist. And if you have a consumer market that can exist, effective demand can exist because people have money to spend, so capitalists can make more money, and then the Keynesian logic can play out. The Keynesian logic being, okay, look, it's kind of good for individual capitalists to try and cut costs, but for capitalism as a whole, what you want is actually well-paid workers. It's the very sort of reformist logic that you get here. It's like, it's good for capitalism when people are well paid. And historically, that's sort of true. If people are well paid, you can sell them more things and make more profit. If you move into a world in which essentials start to demand more and more of people's income, so it's falling real incomes, that effective demand doesn't work so well. In fact, it starts to not really work at all. In fact, you start to end up in a world that isn't really Keynesianism. You end up in a world that also doesn't really produce growth on two sides. One, because you're hit by crises, climate crisis, nature crisis, you can't produce as well and as effectively as you used to, costs are rising. If you have market power, you can turn that into big profits, but you're not actually producing much growth because you don't get much growth if you can't sell any oranges because you don't have any oranges to sell, right? That's the sort of mechanism here. You also don't have a big market that you can sell into because people don't have as much money. And you also probably at some point you find just this process of competition leads you back into kind of military clashes of various sorts. So that's the old economy. The old economy is capitalism working really quite well for 200 odd years. The old economy is growth, it's consumer abundance, there's innovation and technology and all those exciting things thrown in there, all the stuff people like to talk about, and then war, which has kind of been fundamental for a long period of time. But it's a fundamental part of how capitalism operates. It doesn't really get discussed too much in those terms. But put all this together, this is what you get as the old economy. What we're moving into is a new economy, or parts of a new economy, which is not growth but stagnation because of these crises. It's shortages because of these crises and because of profiteering. Don't forget that part of it. And it's still war because the competition that drives the war is still there. Now, you might think, of course, this is not a particularly pleasant sort of move to make on the whole. Like, broadly speaking, it was better to have capitalism that did growth, consumer abundance, and war, although that came at the massive cost of extracting from the environment, than living in a capitalism which looks like stagnation, shortages, and still war, which is the result of the extractions from the environment over that period of time. So that's the kind of broad outline. I wanted to touch on and talk about what I think is a really fascinating, I just think it's really interesting, right, which is why I want to talk about it, but I also want to make the case that if we're thinking that increasingly a world of crises, nature crises, climate crises, is one in which essentials, consumption and production starts to dominate the economy in a way we haven't really seen in industrial world for 200 odd years, 250 years. I want to throw in data as a part of that. Because there's something specific about having a modern life and having a sort of modern living and how capitalism has developed and transformed the world over the last 200 odd years or so, really most dramatically in some ways in the last 20 years, let's call it. And this was this rather striking figure. If we start to think about what is an essential, you might think an essential is something like having running water in your house, which, as it says here, it's about 4.6 billion worldwide have running water in their house. Population's what, 8 and a bit billion, 9 billion nearly now. And then you compare that to who has internet access worldwide in some form. Like, we're not necessarily talking like the latest 5G, you know, here's your fiber optic cables, but you definitely have internet access, 5.4 billion people. So now, if you want to step back and you want to sort of make a fairly obvious point here, you might well think that a world economy that can deliver more internet access than it can running water is one that isn't actually working too well. And I think you'd have a fair point. But nonetheless, it's the economy we live in. And on this basis, internet access, the digital economy, starts to look like something of an essential. And it's been quite extraordinary over the last sort of few years just how much this has blown up. That it's not just the digital economy, and I remember the rhetoric in, like, you know, you have to probably go back 30 years or so, the rhetoric of the weightless economy. That would all be living on thin air was the title of a book in the early 2000s, late 1990s. The idea being that actually what data gave you was the opportunity to completely abstract yourself from material existence. That you could, once you're online, you could be like a digital nomad. You can go and work anywhere you wanted. You could just sort of have this global free market that you'd sell your services into, and that would be, and all of this would just be provided. And it's really incredible reading back through what people were writing then, is that there is almost a literal incomprehension that to enable you to sit in your cafe with a fast internet connection, using your Apple to do whatever thing it is you're doing online, as a lot of people do, there is the most extraordinary infrastructure sitting behind it. That you have to have built up an incredible resource to power the internet. And it's only just about now that this is becoming apparent. I did scribble down some of the figures here. Global internet traffic, I mean, the explosion that's happened. The global internet traffic has grown from 156 gigabytes transferred every second in 2002 to 150,000 gigabytes a second in 2022. So it's about 10,000 times larger than it was over the last 20 years or so. The sort of, I don't know if it's the end point, but the most recent point of this is the growth of what we're calling artificial intelligence, which is really just those same big data analysis techniques applied to what is now an extraordinary amount of data that the companies have access to or try and get access to quite intentionally. That if you use Facebook or Google or whatever, we all know by now it's just generating reams of data which can be processed, mined, and finally now put into a sort of machine learning program and then potentially generate more information out of the other side. It's, by the way, worth noting just how extraordinarily inefficient all of this is. That what you've actually got happening with digital technologies, which depend on this material foundation of energy use, of silicon chips, of servers, of data centers, is not, as it was probably 20 or 30 years ago, relying on radical technological breakthroughs and acceleration of productivity in the underlying technologies. The idea that you could cram more and more transistors onto a single silicon chip, the silicon chip will become exponentially faster over time. This is describing the 1980s, 1990s. This is where the consumer internet becomes a reality. What you've hit since the 2000s is basically hard physical limits to that process. The end of Moore's law, so-called, the limits to Dennard scaling if you're building chips. It's just very difficult to squeeze more transistors onto a chip now because of physical limits. This is a barrier to growth, by the way, a real hard physical barrier to growth that often people don't really concentrate or talk about. So it means that if you are having vast quantities of data, you're now having to have vast quantities of hardware to process that data. So if you start to say, we will use a machine learning program, ChatGPT-3, which required, 175 billion parameters to process, so in other words, units of data. If you're having to try and generate technologies that produce useful or seemingly useful outcomes from data use on this scale, the implication is massive use of energy and other raw materials on the other side. You do not live in a weightless economy. So that, for instance, if you take a single, I've scribbled down here, single hyperscale data center. So one of the big ones that they're now building right across the world. Microsoft, by the way, is opening a new data center somewhere in the world every 3 days or so. So it's a very, very rapid rollout of these things. A single hyperscale data center, in order to cool the servers and provide the air-conditioned environment that the chips sitting in it like to work in, uses the same amount of water as 40,000 households a day. So it's an extraordinary volume of consumption. And people have seen the figures for electricity consumption. You're talking large cities that a single data center can replicate, or at least a small city would probably be a better thing. But you can add these things up, and it becomes absolutely overwhelming, the amount of resource use you're having to put into the things. The story that kind of struck me was just a write-up in the Financial Times. You can tell from the sort of pinkish coloring. Which is that Amazon's just opened a data center. So sort of energy intensive is data center use, that Amazon's just opened one sitting next door to a nuclear power plant of its very own in Pennsylvania, right? Just to give a sort of sense of just how much electricity is being used here. And of course, what's also happening, if we start to think about a world in which there are shortages of water, there are shortages of energy, that these things are becoming harder to get hold of, and what you're saying is we have a technology that demands immense resources to function, immense and worsening amounts of resources to function because the technological drivers that really powered it in the 1990s aren't there anymore, the fundamental technological drivers. What you get is people start to get annoyed that their water, which is in shortage, is being diverted so that, I'm going to be flippant, but so that people can watch TikTok videos or something similar. I didn't include this one here, but I mentioned that because there was another Financial Times story of the Norwegian state-owned arms manufacturer, Nammo, up in sort of mid-Norway, saying that it wasn't able to get enough power to churn out shells that it wanted to sell to Ukraine because the data center on the other side of the river was using all the available energy. TikTok data center on the other side of the river was using all the available energy. Now, it's TikTok and arms manufacturers. You detect a sort of political reason for putting this specific story in the FT. But nonetheless, these shortages are real, and they're provoking protests. And you can start to see things like, Ireland, for example, flags there. The projection for already a third of Ireland's water is diverted into data use. And this, despite it being a very wet country, is also one that is facing these fundamental water shortages. So of course you get protests. Of course you're going to have people objecting to all of this. So you stack all this together. You have something that I think starts to look like, and actually is, an essential industry, in that it is very, very hard to exist in the modern world without some access to the internet, which comes in all sorts of different ways. It can arrive as, this is very necessary for you to do your work, this is very necessary for you to have a social life and to be integrated in society. It may be somewhere down the scale, it may be very necessary for you to be able to operate as a market trader, if you're using a smaller scale version of the internet, mobile connectivity. But nonetheless, you have to have this. The technologies that we use to produce it are increasingly inefficient. It is increasingly inefficient to run things like artificial intelligence. That inefficiency feeds into this shortage economy, which is that you need more and more energy and more water for more and more data centers, which are then running into these underlying shortages in water and energy and the climate crisis. And by the way, I didn't really touch on this, but of course, if you're building data centers, these are very complex pieces of machinery. They're very delicate. You're trying to site them in places that might themselves be subject to extreme weather events. So of course what you're also finding is that more and more data centers are now in places, and you see this, warnings in the US and from the Preparedness Council, that more and more data centers are located in places that are at risk of wildfire, or they're at risk of floods, or they're at risk of hurricanes, which are increasing in numbers. The sensitivities of a global economy, in particular essentials production, once you have more extreme weather events, once you have more shortages, that's another vulnerability in the whole system. So you present all this and you think it looks bleak, frankly, I'd say at this point. You wonder, well, what would be the plausible alternatives? Because what I haven't really talked about here is something you often get with talks on climate change, which is how we need to decarbonize rapidly and how we need to change how we're producing energy and this sort of thing. All of which is true, some of which is more or less accepted by some very major governments around the world, of which China is probably the leading example. The US currently accepts it, but who knows what happens after November. And this does need to happen, but of course, the fact you're going to decarbonize doesn't remove the impacts, the adaptation impacts is really what's going on here, of climate change and nature crises that are already happening. We've already sailed sufficiently far past those boundaries that we won't be seeing any restraint on these sort of shortages anytime soon. So at least part of the question is not only we need to decarbonize rapidly, it starts to look like something like, how do we adapt to a world that looks like this? How do we deal with the fact that things are already bad, that we have this enormous ecological blowback from 250 years of industrial capitalism? What are the steps we need to start to think about, and who, and this is the sort of final part of the talk, who or what might be the agency that we could use or think about to make that sort of change? I want to sort of throw in here something that is sort of deliberately controversial, but I think a fair point, at least I hope it's a fair point. If it's not a fair point, then it's too controversial, I suppose. Which is picking up on, the title here is a book by André Gortz, who was a sort of early political ecologist, called Farewell to the Working Class, which he basically argues that the world is moving to a state where most people aren't in fact working, that we have a non-class of non-workers, was his expression. He's writing in the early 1980s. And he's sort of right. And the other person who's really picked up on this, interestingly, was the Mike Davies, who died, at the end of last year, I think, maybe a bit earlier, the Marxist geographer, particularly in his last book. There's two of his that stick out in this. His last book, which is Old Gods, New Enigmas, and a preceding one from about 20 years ago, very prescient, called Planet of Slums, basically making the argument that although we have, for example, mass urbanization, what is it, 300 million people or so moved from rural areas in China to urban areas in the last 20 years. So it's one of the biggest sort of population movements in history. This is an incredible driver of the industrialization of China and its integration into the world economy. And that's one version of it. The other version of it is that you have the growth of absolutely enormous slums, where you have people moving into big cities, and you can think of them scattered across the global south, which are becoming huge, but not having the same integration into the global economy. And that was already taking place. And I think it's an interesting idea, because it starts to give you a picture of what the world looks like, in which, yes, there's a very large number, ILO, for International Labour Organization figures on this, you're talking a good few billions, of people who are identifiably working class in the way we'd classically recognize this. And that doesn't just mean you work in a factory and you make things. It could be that you're working in McDonald's and you serve things. Like there's a whole service sector working class, again, particularly in the richer developed countries that you've seen develop over the last it's always been there, but it's really exploded in the last 30, 40 years or so. And that you can recognize as a working class. It's a formal employment contract. It has some relationship to this very big globalized economy that otherwise exists. What you also have growing up is a very, very large informal sector. I mean, Guy Standing called it the precariat. You can name this group various different things. It's a very large number of people who do not have that integration into global circuits of capital, even if it's somewhat indirect in the same way. They have only a partial integration into labour markets. They may, for instance, work as an Uber driver over here, and then go and work for Deliveroo over there, and then otherwise try some sort of, side hustles online of various sorts, a range of different bits and pieces of part jobs, none of which adds up to like a complete integration into the global circuits of capital. And this group of people has become very, very large in recent years, that you do not have you had an expansion of the working class, most obviously in China, and its integration into the wider global circuits of capital, not just China, actually, East Asia in general. But then you do not have that same process taking place across much of the global south. You just get large slums, you get urbanization, but not the same integration. Now, the really interesting thing here is this. And I'm picking up on as it says, a 2020 article from McKinsey, the notorious management consultants, and the headline kind of sums up what they're arguing. Will India get too hot to work? And India, obviously, fairly hot country already, and it is one where if you go and look at what the Indian government says and what newspapers or magazines like The Economist say, and you can go and find lots of sort of conventional wisdom in this, which is something like India, it can be the new China. It has a large number of people who are not integrated into global labour markets, and this is the key to rapid growth in India. And some of that is sort of already happening, right? India is one of the fastest growing large economies on the planet at the minute, much more so than China, and has been for a few years. So you can sort of see that happening. But in order for that to happen, you have to have people able to work. You have to have people who can move from whatever it is they are doing at the minute, so typically sort of rural labour, agricultural labour of some sort, and move them, to use a bit of a cliche, but it's what's happened over and over again, move them into a factory doing somewhat higher productivity work, making things you can sell into a global market. And this is sort of classic, how does industrialization happen? How does globalization happen? How do you integrate into a global market? You can do that if it is relatively cheap for you to do this. You can do that if you can go to China as a sort of Western multinational and stick your investment in with some controls from the government, stick your investment in and rely on the fact there's a very large number of basically healthy, pretty well-educated people who will come and work in your factory for not very much money. And you can repeat doing this for a long period of time and you get a great deal of growth. And China becomes the fastest growing economy on the planet for a long period of time because of this. And it's reasonably cheap to do that. If you're going to somewhere where suddenly it is quite expensive to move people into a factory, because, for example, it is too hot to work in a factory, so you have to install air conditioning, you have to cool the factory. Suddenly it becomes expensive to do this. There's a rising barrier to participation that arises from the climate crisis. And it's basically McKinsey's argument that because large parts of India, on the models we have, are just going to become unbearably hot, too hot for humans to live and too hot beyond that for people to work, it is not going to be possible, you would think, for India to integrate in the same way into the global economy that China did. In other words, what this starts, and you can repeat that process. You can go look across the global south where you find countries are in this similar sort of situations where it becomes so hot that it becomes too expensive. Not just so hot, actually. You're hit by extreme weather conditions of all sorts. You're hit by floods and droughts and a whole stack of things that might start to happen. It becomes too expensive for that integration to take place, which means you end up with a fix, really, or a limit on how big the global working class is ever going to be, which is probably around about now, and an increasing proportion of the world which is not really part of the working class, which is left in this sort of in-between situation, which has fairly dramatic consequences if you think about what are the politics that come out of this. Because if you take the kind of classic Marxist, socialist, left-wing thing, it is, who will be the gravedigger of capitalism? It is the working class. But if the working class is reaching a kind of limit on what it can do, is reaching a limit on how big it's going to become, if it can't turn itself into at least a majority of the world's population, and it potentially isn't going to be able to do that because of the climate crisis, its source of agency is weakened. It still exists. You can still go and strike, and it does something. But its fundamental capacity in the kind of classic socialist scheme of saying this is the agency that will transform the whole world, it will pull everyone else along behind it, is significantly weakened under these circumstances. That means you have to try and look for something else. If you start to think, and if you do think, I suggest you should think about a world in which capitalism is no longer producing growth, no longer producing consumer abundance, but is instead producing shortages, profiteering, stagnation, falling real living standards for people, because it can't deal with the climate and nature crises in a way that works for people. You should be thinking about what would be the alternative to this. And if you're thinking about what would be the alternative to this, you have to think about how would that alternative exist? How would we get the political capacity to find enough people who want to change this and have the capacity to try and change this? And it's here that I want to pick up on, I thought it was a very good short book by A.J. Singh Chowdhury called The Exhausted of the Earth, which he makes quite forcefully the case. And I think there's something very important to this. Quite forcefully the case that what you're looking at in the world today is what he calls the category of exhaustion. In other words, it's lots of people just sort of burnt out in lots of different ways. That life has become a sort of struggle for very, very large numbers. That if you're in a world of shortages and falling living standards and long hours, you're kind of burnt out the whole time. And if you're in a world where you are facing repeated uncertainties, this enshittification of everything, that your house is suddenly at risk, as people have found in East London, of wildfires, which is like an incredible thing, that your water supply, as the government in Britain has been warning us, might suddenly be cut off, that the plane you're on is hit by more turbulence than it used to be, that all these small things start to add up into a real sort of battering effect. And his suggestion is, of course, that if you have these climate impacts in one part of the world over here, that if you suddenly find yourself facing water shortages in Britain or anywhere else in Europe, that is quite similar to if you're facing a water shortage right now in Mexico. In fact, you're basically in exactly the same position. Like, you don't have enough water, and you need to try and organize some way to deal with this. That there is a kind of commonality of experience in crisis, which starts to provide the potential for a political link-up. Now, of course, this can work hard in the other direction. If you take Europe as the example, the political example on this, that European farming is in crisis. The potato harvest this year has been devastated by floods in northern Europe. Olive oil rather, I've mentioned, is hit by droughts. You can go through a list of any number of things you try and grow that, lo and behold, don't grow too well when the climate has been shaken up. That's the fundamental reason that European farming is in crisis. The political response to this has been for a successful and effective movement to develop and say, gosh, all of these things look like rising costs for farmers. The quickest cost to get rid of for farmers is all these stupid environmental protections. We must cut those environmental protections. We must cut the climate change protections. And this has worked. There's been a rollback across the EU in these things because of that protest movement. In other words, the impact of climate change, far from it being the sort of, the scales fall from our eyes and we're like, oh my God, climate change is really happening, things are bad. The actual political impact of climate change, importantly in Europe, is playing out in at least one dimension as a perverse response to try and actually do things that will make climate change worse, right? That's the political response that's developed. There is no guarantee that if you're in a world subject to these uncertainties, these chaotic shocks, that everything costs more, there is no guarantee. Looking at all that people will just go, okay, then the obvious thing to do is this is some product of a nature and climate crisis and we need to do something about capitalism. So there's no guarantee that once you're in a world subject to those sorts of shocks, everybody will go in the right direction. That the space is wide open for different versions of politics. And I'd put to you that the far right in Europe is doing a very good job of climate change politics because they are adapting better to a world in which climate change is really happening than much to the left, which still thinks about what might we do about this thing in the future. That we need a politics that addresses the immediacy, that problem of exhaustion, that problem of shortages, that problem of the fact that everything's chaotic and nothing really works, and we need to do it quickly because otherwise you end up with some extremely bad, extremely unpleasant